Brioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 234, The Crimean War. In today's episode, we're going to separate ourselves, for a bit at least, from the discussions of Welsh cultural changes in the mid-century and the changes in education and societal changes and how they relate to the Welsh experience. We're going to move into the major war between Britain and other European powers, one of the first since the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the century, and the one that brings us into modern warfare for the first time, and also is uniquely one of the first times where France and Britain are actually fighting on the same side, something of a novelty at this point. The Crimean War, of course, if you know, was a battle between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, with her allies, the Ottomans, being Britain, France, and Sardinia, the state within then the Italian peninsula. From 1853 to 1856, the war raged as Tsar Nicholas I sought to spread Russian influence to the Middle East through trade routes controlled by the Ottoman Empire. At its heart, the war was about the balance of power in Europe and the Middle East, particularly concerning the control of territories in the Black Sea region. The war is often remembered for its brutal conditions, the suffering of the soldiers, and the emerging role of modern media in shaping public opinion about the war. Something I think we kind of forget about is how much newspapers in this era are starting to influence public perception in Western society. They will play a massive role from this point forward in most of the rest of the wars that will take place well up until the current time, and their influence will be felt strongly because of it. So much so that the government starts to seek to influence it to keep it from becoming a problem for them. So let's get down to this, shall we? The spark that set off the war was religious tension between the Catholics and Orthodox believers, including the Russians, over the access to Jerusalem. Conflict between the various Christian sects over this had been going on for millennia, and at this point, the Ottomans, who were neither Christian, Orthodox, nor Catholic, had control of all of it. And they controlled these sacred sites under Muslim domination, which, as you can imagine, led to conflict in and of itself. After there was some violence in Bethlehem, in which Orthodox monks were killed, Nicholas sent an emissary to the Sultan, Abdul Mesid I, to demand not only equal access to these religious sites, but also that the Sultan recognize Nicholas as the protector of the Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman Empire. This was something of a thing that was happening quite frequently, is that there was this discussion about who protected the local Christians in Islamic territory, stretching from top of the Black Sea all the way down to northern Africa. There was this control that the Ottomans had, and because of that, they were able to dominate much of the discussion points for many, many years, ever since the capture of Constantinople in the 1400s. This, however, meant that the Orthodox Church would frequently have various parties who were of Orthodox faith lead the political side of the discussion. And of course, the Russians wanted to be in that position, and it was something of a coup if they could gain control of it. While this idea was then rejected by the Ottoman Sultan, Nicholas decided that he must force the issue, and he then took Moldavia and Wallachia, two major portions of now Romania, including the capital of Bucharest in those two places. In response to this aggression, the Ottomans declared war on the Russians in October of 1853. The early part of the war, as you can imagine, was very difficult for the Ottomans. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and much of the Russian military was more modernized than the Ottomans, who were still badly behind most of Europe in how their militaries were structured and also how they were issued equipment and their abilities to fight, not because they were bad fighters, but simply because the strategies and tactics of modern warfare had changed dramatically over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the Ottomans were still basically doing a feudal system of fighting, which no longer worked in the current mode. So they were getting basically beaten. The early part of the war saw the Ottomans getting badly mauled by the Russians as they were trying to fight them. The final straw for much of the Western powers was the destruction of some of the fleets anchored at the Black Sea port of Sinop, where over 2,000 sailors, Ottoman sailors specifically, were killed in the attack, while the Russian losses themselves were minimal. Public perception in the West was outraged, and there were general calls being made to defend the Ottomans from Russian forces. This goes back to the influence of the media and the fact that they were covering this war and sending back reports via telegram. So while you don't have, instant 24-hour news, you're still getting relatively quick updates of what's going on, something that will continue to increase over the coming years. And it sees that the attitude of the public is changing based on the editorial opinions of the various papers in London. Britain, of course, would join the war to protect its trade routes through the Ottoman Empire all the way to India, which, of course, at this time has become a key colony for Britain, while the French saw the fight as a bit of a revenge for the losses that Napoleon faced 40 years earlier when he invaded Russia. 4 months into the fighting, in March of 1854, France and Britain formally threw their support to the Ottomans and prepared troops to fight against the Russian aggression. They thought they would make short work of this antiquated Russian military, as these were the superpowers of the Victorian age, and they were looking to bring their full might against the Tsar and his forces. It must be noted at the same time the Prussians and the Austrians, who also were around at this time, could have helped one side or the other, but decided to effectively stay out of the war because they had enough of their own issues going on, in fact, between the Prussians and the Austrians, let alone the Prussians, the Russians, the Brits, and the French, that I don't think they wanted to be involved, and thus two major powers stayed out of the battle. Probably set up what would be the hostility that the Russians would feel towards these two parties later on. And even though all of these various alliances continue to be very fluid in this period, there is nonetheless this setting that's being put in place. You could almost hear from these Allied forces the idea that they would be home by Christmas, ringing through the streets of London as these troops left port. Much like so many other times, this idea of superiority and that the war would end quickly rings out often in later years and fails to accomplish this. There was some accuracy in the fact that they were the superior military. The problem is that they were extending their supply lines thousands of miles away into Russian-held territory, and it wasn't going to be as easy as they were perceiving it. This was a war where bloodshed was high, and with it, as well as the later U.S. Civil War, should have been a banner to the new style of warfare that was happening, specifically the heavy use of artillery and trench warfare, which would become a feature of both of those wars, actually, quite frankly, should have been an early warning sign to the European powers that the way of fighting was changing, and that, if anything, it was going to get much worse. Instead, I could argue that they failed to pick up on that at all. On September 14th, 1854, the combined Allied forces landed 60,000 troops at Eupatoria, a town north of Sevastopol on the west coast of Crimea. This apparently caught the Russians by surprise, as they had no defense in place to protect themselves in that location. In fact, they were based 25 miles south at the River Alma instead. The heads of the combined allies were Lord Raglan and Marshal Jacques Leroy de Saint Arnaud. These two would work together to bring their troops into this battle, but the one thing I will say early on is that the allies were not coordinated together. They did not always, at least at this beginning point, conceptualize a war fought as allies instead of a war fought as two different countries. As they moved south, they reached the River Alma, and that was where they met their first resistance. On September 20th, the two sides fought for control of the river. Prince Menshikov led the Russian forces, and they had higher ground overlooking the river. They expected themselves to take a frontal assault and had assumed that cliff faces behind them would be effectively too difficult to get up, and instead left that highly unguarded. The French and the British forces, as I mentioned, didn't really fight together, and in fact, the French took the cliffs, the harder terrain, but easier defensible areas, while the British took the frontal assault. Arriving as a part of the British troops at Alma was the 23rd Regiment of the Welsh Fusiliers. They became key members of these battles and would be mentioned quite frequently after this. They fought in this battle as the Allies were threatened by the Russian position controlling what was called the Great Redoubt, and they would eventually take 14 heavy guns at this redoubt, which were effectively devastating the center point of the Russian assault. On the 20th of September, the 23rd surged up the steep slope towards the redoubt. The ensigns carrying the colors, or battle flags, were killed in this assault, and Sergeant Luke O'Connor, also badly wounded, seized the Queen's colors and dashed towards the top of the redoubt and planted those battle flags up there. The British were twice unsuccessful in assaulting the Russians' main position to their right, and eventually, though, the superior firepower forced the Russians to retreat. Both flanks would turn, and the Russian position collapsed as they fled. The battle was a mess, and it showed by the casualties. The French took roughly 1,600 casualties, both wounded and dead, the British 2,000, and the Ottomans 500, at least according to some sources, because there were others that mentioned that the Allies as low as 962 losses, but that was probably deaths rather than wounded included. As bad as those were, the Russians would take 5,700 casualties of their own, which meant they were too weak to follow up on an engagement which had bloodied both sides. The 23rd themselves had sustained 200 casualties in the assault. The Fusiliers, alongside other Welsh regiments, were among the first to land in Crimea. The harsh conditions they faced were unimaginable, from the freezing winters to the sweltering summers. They were a part of a campaign that would test the resolve of every soldier. Yet the Welsh regiments were not only known for their endurance, but their bravery in battle. We'll discuss a little bit of that here. We're not going to go into great detail, and there are better places to read in further detail about this war, but I wanted to discuss main points of it because of how significant it is for later what goes on. The Allies set up a base in the Bay of Balaclava to help supply the besieging forces around Sevastopol, who had arrived towards the end of September and the beginning of October. The Russians knew if they were to break the siege, they would need to capture this port and cut the supply lines between it and the besieging forces. On October 25th, 1854, the Battle of Balaclava took place, and it was a key moment in the history of the British military. One that showed both their bravery and stupidity in one key day. Not dissimilar to Lee's forces of Confederates at Gettysburg, it was here that the famous Charge of the Light Brigade happened. But while much of the focus is on the British cavalry's ill-fated and mistaken charge, it was the infantry, including, amongst others, the Fusiliers, who played a role in defending British positions and repelling Russian forces. The Russian commander, General Pavel Liprandi, started the battle by launching an assault to the northeast of Balaclava, trying to cut the road lines between the bay and the besiegers. His forces seized a series of Turkish positions on the heights overlooking the road between Balaclava and the siege lines at Sevastopol. At the same time, they also took several British naval gun positions on the high ground. In response, the British commander, Lord Raglan, ordered some of the troops attacking Sevastopol to leave their lines and support the outnumbered defenders. Russian cavalry moved swiftly in the morning to punch a hole in the lines of Allied troops that were surging forward. Guarding the valley leading to the port, they ran into the 93rd Highland Regiment of Foot, better known as an infantry regiment of Scottish people. These 500 men along of the 93rd Southern Highlanders, led by Sir Colin Campbell, aided by a small force of about 100 walking wounded and 40 detached guardsmen, and were supported by a substantial force of Turkish infantrymen or Ottoman infantrymen, who formed a line of fire against the Russian cavalry. The Allies, who were outnumbered, took an unconventional approach in the face of this attack, making 2 lines instead of the more traditional square of 4 lines. Specifically, a cavalry attack, you want to have more guns behind to help the wall of fire that's coming through. And effectively, what happens as a kind of an explanation in this kind of warfare is you have a front line that fires and retreats back, a second line that fires and retreats back, a third line that fires and retreats back, and a fourth line that fires and retreats back. And while the fourth line is retreating back, the first line moves forward and does it again. That's kind of how you do it. It gives time for the back group to reload and move forward while the other groups are moving backward to reload themselves. And thus you keep a constant rate of fire. Well, you don't have that with 2 lines. With 2 lines, you're just firing, reloading, firing again. So you don't have the same hail of fire that you would have if you were in a normal situation. In the face of these oncoming Russian horses, however, the Highland commander, Major General Campbell, told his troops, quote, "There is no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand," end quote. The story goes that as the Russians charged forward, the Ottoman troops broke and fled, leaving the British troops to face the oncoming enemy. They fired 2 volleys of musket balls at the advancing enemy, which then turned the Russians back. Even as I say this, though, there are some historians who have suggested that the Russians were merely launching a probing attack and that they learned what they needed to know and then retreated. Of course, this particular day is known much more for the charge of the Light Brigade, which was a mistaken charge against the wrong set of guns, which led to an absolute disaster and would be reminiscent in a way of Pickett's charge 10 years later in the face of orders being misunderstood and carried out when maybe they shouldn't have been. Far from being a quick and decisive siege, the battle for the port became a slog, reminiscent of medieval siege warfare, but also with modern weapons and tactics. As the siege set in, both sides dug extensive trench lines around Sevastopol. Soldiers were forced to suffer through a brutal Russian winter, and many fell victim to something that at that time was called trench madness, or shell shock as it would become known 60 years later. From the constant artillery bombardments and the threat of enemy raids, and it would eventually take 11 months before a French assault forced the Russians to evacuate Sevastopol. Throughout the Crimean War, Welsh soldiers fought in several key engagements, including the siege of Sevastopol, which was a protracted and grueling battle. The Welsh Fusiliers, alongside other British units, endured horrific conditions, disease, hunger, and constant threat of enemy fire. The 23rd were called into battle at the Great Redan, an ultimately futile attempt to break a key bastion in Sevastopol by both French and British troops in June of 1855. Troops were caught in a horror show of a crossfire, which led the Russians build up their defenses and protect themselves at least for a period of time. As the attack stalled, Major General Sir William Codrington, in a last desperate attempt to break the defense, sent forward a wing of the 23rd Regiment. It was hoped that the 23rd might be able to enter the Redan by its right face and get behind the Russian defenders. But when this attempt failed, the rout of British troops, desperately clinging to the outside of the salient, began, and it created an inevitable retreat. This meant it took the rest of the summer before the Allies were once again willing to attack, this time breaking the final spine of the Russian defenses. While the soldiers were on the front lines in Crimea, as you can imagine, their families were left behind in Wales, often with little news of their loved one's fate. The Crimean War had far-reaching effects on Welsh society, both socially and economically. For the Welsh, the war represented both pride and pain. On one hand, the involvement of Welsh soldiers in such a high-profile conflict brought national pride to a people who had often been overshadowed by their English counterparts. The heroic efforts of the Welsh Fusiliers, for example, were widely celebrated. But, on the other hand, the war brought immense hardship, both of loss of life, and many Welsh families found themselves mourning the death of brothers, fathers, and sons. Thousands of soldiers died from injuries and disease like cholera, and the harsh conditions of war generally. The human toll on Wales was significant, with entire communities grieving the loss of their young men. An echo of what is to come, let's be fair. Wales, at the same time, was still heavily reliant on agriculture, and particularly in coal mining, and the absence of so many young men took a serious economic toll. In some mining communities, the loss of life during the war meant a shortage of laborers, leading to a disruption of the coal production, which had repercussions for local economies. However, in amongst all that, heroes were emerging from all parts of Wales. Lost to some degree by the story of Florence Nightingale are the stories of two Welsh women who had a major influence on the war. Mary Seacole and Betsy Cadwaladr were two women of significance. Betsy was moved by an article in the Times telling of the conditions faced by those injured at the Battle of Alma, and she decided to train as a nurse in London, and she joined the military nursing services because of this. Florence Nightingale, a woman we've already mentioned who is much more famous, came herself from a privileged background and did not want the Welsh working class Betsy to go into Crimea. But Betsy, who was now in her 60s, went anyway. She was posted to the hospital run by Florence Nightingale in Scutari in the Ottoman Empire in what is now Turkey. As you can imagine, there was conflict between these two very strong-willed women. Nightingale felt that the strict rules and regulations should be in place, whereas Betsy believed in more instinctive and intuitive approaches to caring for the sick. Cadwaladr was eventually moved to Balaclava. She worked 20-hour days and made massive improvements to the hospital there. Even Nightingale was impressed by Betsy's work in Balaclava. Cadwaladr was forced to return to London in 1855, however, as she was suffering from cholera and dysentery. She would die in 1860. The other woman we mentioned, Mary Seacole, arrived at Crimea to find terrible conditions. Many of the soldiers were cold, dirty, and hungry, as you can imagine, and there were sick and wounded everywhere who were not being cared for. Mary decided something had to be done, and so, with her loyal friend Thomas, she opened the British Hotel near the battlefield. It was basically a hut made of metal sheets where soldiers could rest and buy hot food, drink, and equipment. There were a lot of nurses during the Crimean War, and they did invaluable work. But Mary went even a step further because she would ride on horseback into the battlefields, even while under fire, to nurse wounded men from both sides of the war. After the Crimean War ended, Mary returned to London with very little money and in poor health. but her hard work did not go unrecognized. Many of the soldiers wrote to newspapers about all that she had done for them, and 80,000 people attended a charity gala in her honor in 1857. The Russians were shaken by the loss of Sevastopol in October of 1855, with their mainland base of Kinburn also falling to the Allies. When the Austrians then threatened to enter the war against them, the Russians agreed to peace terms, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in March of 1856. With the conclusion of the war, it also ended the suffering and death. It was estimated that around 650,000 people died in the war, let alone innumerable amount beyond that who were casualties and injured, and probably suffered after the fact from sickness and death. From a Russian perspective, the war was disastrous. The Russian Empire was forced to retreat after a prolonged siege in Sevastopol. The Treaty of Paris effectively neutralized Russian ambitions in the Black Sea. However, the war also sparked a wave of reform in Russia, as Tsar Alexander II, having seen the vulnerabilities exposed by the war, began a series of reforms, most notably the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, in what he hoped would be a modernization of Russia's economy. For Wales, the Crimean War left a lasting legacy. The memory of the war, particularly the heroics of the Welsh military men, would inspire future generations of Welshmen to serve in the military. The war also sparked a sense of national identity, as the Welsh saw their soldiers as symbols of both strength and resilience. In the years that followed, Welsh communities held memorial services, erected monuments, and named streets after soldiers who had fought and died in Crimea. The war also brought to attention the hardships faced by returning soldiers, many of whom came back from Crimea and were physically and emotionally scarred, and their integration into post-war society was difficult, as you can imagine, and is something that we deal with even today. In addition to the commemorative efforts, the Crimean War also played a role in shaping Welsh political and social movements. The war highlighted the power of the British Empire and raised questions about the role of the working class in warfare. As industrialization swept through Wales, the war served as a reminder of the interconnectedness between military service, class, and national identity, something that, again, we see echoes coming in future as we reach the Great War, where Wales will feel the pain and suffering in much greater detail and will be left with a legacy which will change it for generations to come. And as I said, I wanted to talk about this war specifically because I think it sets the stage for what we see as the modern world, very similar to how educational changes, unionization, the change of the way people are working, and the rise of urbanization is also modernizing the world that was previously not at all in this form or fashion. Keep in mind, it wasn't that long ago when most militaries were basically either just small professional class or mercenaries, or if you go back far enough, being led by a lord whom everybody owed their various allegiances to and were then called up to fight when needed. All of this is changing dramatically as what we know as nation states are forming, and what we know about warfare changes dramatically. We've seen in the Napoleonic Wars and now in the Crimean War the beginning of what is modern warfare. Trenches, artillery, heavy weapons, and the defeat really of at that time, the cavalry as a weapon to be used is starting to develop at this point. Keep in mind that horse cavalry is still being used up to the Great War, and it's only with the advent of machine guns and devastating attacks that are brought through the Great War that this actually starts to end, and they develop and instill the idea of tank warfare and all the changes that will come into what we see as modern warfare now. And yet, even if you look in places like Ukraine, where the war is going on there right now, as I record, you still see trench warfare as still a thing. The idea of the effects of constant warfare in cold, miserable conditions in areas where water can pool and make life even worse, where there are rats and mice infesting these areas. The idea of a modern warfare where things are moving quickly has come to a halt in this current environment. And it shows that modern warfare at its developmental stage becomes this kind of slog warfare. And all of this is something we're starting to see. And yet, even as this is going on, the people within the military and especially within the society are ignoring it and not paying as much attention as they probably should and getting the lessons from it that they probably should. So, with all of that said and done, let me thank you all for listening and viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me on any number of social media sites such as X, Blue Sky, and Instagram at the Welsh History Pod. You can also reach out on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you're so inclined to help with future endeavors that I'm going to be doing, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you once again. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.